today we're all going to be discussing about how to choose between multiple acceptances, especially if you got into both BSMD and traditional schools. Before we get started though, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more great content about direct med and medical school admissions. All right, Kavya, kick us off. Can you introduce yourself a little bit and some of your experiences?
Yeah, hi, I'm Kavya. I'm currently a first-year medical student, and I'm actually in a BSMD program myself. And I guess in terms of the topic, I had the experience of having to choose between multiple BSMD programs and traditional schools. So I just wanted to give my input.
Perfect. All right, we're glad that you're able to join us for this talk because there is quite a few things to consider as students are going through this process. So the first one about financial costs. What are some things that students should consider when they think about the financial costs of both BSMD and traditional schools, Nicole?
Yeah, there's a lot. So when I used to work in student financial services, just for regular undergraduate, regardless of BSMD or not, there's so many things to think about just financially. We're talking about scholarships, cost of tuition, how tuition could rise each year, housing costs, how that can change each year, and there's always those extra add-on fees. But when we're talking about BSMD versus, a traditional school, what should we choose? Thinking about scholarships for undergrad versus med school. A lot of times they'll give you a scholarship for the undergraduate portion, but it won't follow through to the med school. There's a lot of financial costs affiliated with college, of course, but making sure you're really understanding what you're kind of signing up for, especially if you're doing a BSMD program.
I feel like that's like the one of the first things that students should probably look at whenever they are making their college list in general, kind of the financial costs of both the undergraduate school and if it is like a BSMD program, potentially the medical school as well. But it's one of those things I think people don't want to have like those tough conversations at the beginning. And so like at the end, you are kind of maybe faced with a little bit of like a sticker shock when you see how much some programs, some schools can really cost. So
Absolutely.
if you
I
have a
also feel like there's a little bit of a false narrative around like, oh, there's so many scholarships out there, which there are a ton of scholarships out there. There are just not as many out there that are really going to truthfully move the needle when it comes to tuition costs. Talking about, in-state versus out-of-state, that's going to be where you're moving the needle much more.
Mhm. Definitely. Yeah, 'cause not everything can be like a 20,000 per year scholarship, which will make a big dent. Sometimes it is just a couple thousand, which of course is
Hmm.
nothing to like turn up your nose at, but when tuitions can cost, 80,000, 50,000
Yeah,
each
yeah.
year, it can really add up.
I've definitely had families who, when we have conversations about the list and we talk about, well, you as a family talk about where you're comfortable being at financially, and they, we're not going to worry about that. We'll get scholarship later on, and making sure that that's actually something that would happen because it's not always feasible
Mm,
to get as much as people think.
yes. And they think that, oh, we'll be able to handle anything that comes their way. And then they actually see the cost
Hmm.
and realize,
Hmm.
oh no, like we actually
Yeah,
can't. Um, it's not cheap. It's not
yeah.
cheap to go to college, especially out of state. And some of these private schools can be
And
quite
schools are not super transparent about what their costs are on their website. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging.
definitely, definitely. Yeah.
So
So
I
finan
always say, once you have all of your acceptances, take all of your financial aid letters together. I've had families print them out and just kind of look at them all side by side. And that's a great way to really to just consider financially, what your options are in terms of what schools you are accepted to.
point. And sometimes too, correct me if I'm wrong, Nicole, because you would probably know better than me, but sometimes you'll get maybe like a scholarship just for the first year and it's not renewable. So like those types of things are important to look at too, because you might see that your first year
Hmm.
is pretty reasonable, but then once that grant or the scholarship or whatever it is goes away, it can make a huge
Yeah, they don't always auto renew. And I mean, if you're going to a BSMD program, you likely have to meet these requirements anyway, but a lot of them have requirements you have to continue to meet,
yeah.
making sure that you're knowing that you have to do that.
Hmm. So yeah, financial costs, I think, in my opinion, one of the big first hurdles because it doesn't really matter if like everything else is perfect. If like you can't financially afford it, it doesn't really matter how like perfect the fit
Mhm.
is. So that's always the first kind of hurdle I think students will have to encounter. What about school size and class sizes? How how do you kind of consider, or how do you advise students to think about this?
Yeah, so a huge question that we get usually when we're making the list, again, when we're narrowing it down based on acceptances, is I want to go to the best school, and I don't believe in that technically. I think, the best school for you. So really identifying what type of placement you as a student are going to be the most successful in. A lot of students, most of our students are the high flyers, they're the big fish, and sometimes a really small pond. So they really have to do some reflection to see, will they be successful in a larger community like that? What kind of atmosphere, what kind of class size, do you want to have the teacher know you by name? Is that something that's important to you? If so, a huge school is not going to be maybe the best fit for you. This is why college tours are so important, to really see it. It's really hard to say, would you thrive in a classroom full of 15 or 50? It's really hard for high school students and really anyone to kind of conceptualize that. But a lot of times, if you go on tours, I know the school that I used to work at, the university I used to work at, offered this where you could go and sit in on classes and really feel what 50 kids versus 300 kids versus 15 feels like. So really identifying the atmosphere that you'll thrive in.
Definitely. And I feel like Googling it sometimes is deceptive because a lot of the times they'll be like, 80% of our classes have 20 kids or less. It's like
Hmm.
those intro level classes that a lot of the times is where your first kind of introduction into college too, you're getting your feet wet, and you might be in a biology class. It's 300 kids deep, stadium seating. Like if you miss that class, no one is going to notice that you're not there. And so some kids, like, that is not the environment that they are going to thrive in. And so it's just not going to be a good fit. And of course, once you get older and like get to higher level, like more like specialized classes, a lot of the times those do get smaller, but you have to make it to that level. Now, what about location? Kavya, did that kind of play a role when you were making your choice?
It was definitely something I considered. I did think about whether or not I wanted to be in a city or a college town versus somewhere more suburban or rural. So that's something I really did consider. I think I found myself leaning towards city and college towns just for like access to a bunch of different opportunities or just like being able to explore the city nearby. So I do think I'm weighing what environment you're living in is also an important consideration because you do want to also pick something that will fit with your lifestyle.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's so true for both, honestly, both BSMD and traditional. It's like if you know that you would not be happy like in a rural setting, or you hate cities, like even if you did get into a BSMD program, kind of goes back to like the class sizes. It's just like not going to be the right fit for you. And so you don't necessarily want to set yourself up for unhappiness and potential failure if you're not in the right place. And a lot of our kids, this is their first experience really far away from home. The parents might want them accessible, like close by, or at the very minimum, like, easy to get back home to. Like how far is the flight? How far are you from an airport? Like, those types of things might be small, but things that you can kind of should be considering as you go through this process.
And those are huge added costs also that people don't really think about. We can talk about cost of tuition and housing, but what about flights home? What about, storage facilities for your furniture and things like that? It really adds up after a while. So
So
definitely something to think about.
especially since a lot of the times kids are flying home, especially in the like, the beginning, like the first flights might be Thanksgiving and they might be Christmas, which are like the Christmas holiday break.
The
And so
highest,
the
the
high
highest the flights are. Yeah.
the most expensive. And so those are just can be huge costs. So things to think about.
And then
And
if you're not even close to an airport, I mean, some of these schools are not close, you
Mhm.
know, so that's definitely another added kind of level of having to get home.
Yeah, I was on a flight like myself recently coming flying out of Chicago, and the guy sitting next to me said he came all the way from like Iowa. I was like, I can't even imagine like how long he must have like left his house to get here. And obviously that's kind of an extreme
Hmm.
example, but it's like there's no way if he needed to come home for like a quick little weekend trip, it is not going to be quick. There is no like little 2 day, 3 days at home, most likely for him. If he had to go, a couple hours away from his home to get to the airport and then fly, could take him a full day. So thinking
Yeah.
about those types of things can play a huge factor.
And you don't really realize those things, like definitely not until it's happening to you. Like personally, I've never lived less than like 15 miles from an international airport, from multiple international airports,
Mhm.
So having that change, would be huge for
Yeah.
me. So I know that now, but I don't know if I necessarily would have recognized that at 17, 18 years old,
Oh yeah, that was the last thing on my
unless
mind.
someone asked me. Yeah. Yeah.
Those small little things, think about them as you're kind of choosing between both BSMD and traditional. Now, what about like the difficulty of pre-med versus like meeting program requirements? What were some things that were going through your head, Kavya, when you were thinking about those types of things, and what should students consider?
Yeah, I definitely considered what would I need to do for the program? Do my programs have requirements versus going to the traditional route and, you know, being a typical pre-med. So I think I started to think that the BSMD programs were a lot more strict just because they would have either MCAT or GPA requirements. Some schools even have resume requirements, such as like doing research or volunteering. But as I thought about it more, I realized if I was going to be pre-med, I would still need to take the MCAT, need to have like a really good GPA. I would have to volunteer, shadow, do research, show a bunch of leadership and things like that. So I do think they end up evening out. If anything, the BSMD program can be more lax with its requirements. And then on top of that, like if you want to be super competitive on the traditional route of applying to med school, like you want to do super well on your MCAT and have a really high GPA in order to get into med school, which is already difficult enough to get into.
Yeah, I feel like that added stress of just knowing that you need to maintain your GPA. And like, it's always like the question mark too. Like, so for example, for Drexel's BSMD program, you have to maintain like a 3.6. Like that is like a hard number. Whereas I feel like if you are pre-med, you're just like aiming for as high as possible. And so you could have a 3.6 and still feel like you're kind of like behind or like, not enough, and those types of things. So I think that can really be just a huge mental stress on students, and just not wanting to maybe take more challenging classes, or not wanting to stray too far, trying to pick like an easier major just so that they can, preserve their GPA for as long as possible, would be kind of my thought. And yeah, I think you're totally right. I'm looking up the Drexel like College of Medicine, like what their medium scores are. So it looks like, for their BSND program, you have to get a 511 to stay in the program. And then the medium score was a 512. So it's not a huge difference, but I have seen some BSMD programs like where you have to get 4 or 5 points like less than what you would need to do to actually get into the program. So that's maybe like not a great example, but I have seen other schools where it is quite high comparatively for like the BSMD requirements. So I think it is can make it a lot easier for students.
Yeah, in my BSMD program, our requirement was to get basically like a 510. And then I know the average for my class was like a 519 MCAT
Oh,
score.
oh my
So
gosh.
there can be a very big difference.
That is a huge difference. Yeah. A 519 would be a lot harder to get than a 510. Not that a 510 wouldn't be difficult, but a 519 I think would add a whole lot more stress. And you could get a 519 and still not get accepted to the medical school. So there's just like so many other factors. And at least you knew you had that score, you're definitely in, as long as you meet all
Yeah,
the other requirements.
exactly.
And I know you kind of already touched on this a little bit too, but a lot of those BSMD programs do have like the requirements, like going back to Drexel as my example, you have to have 100 hours of service that's like documented and approved by the advisor, and things along those lines. I've seen, similar requirements. USC has like a research component with them that you have to participate in. But to be honest, like 100 hours of volunteering over the course of like those 3 or 4 years is really nothing compared to what I'm sure a traditional pre-med student is doing. So usually none of the requirements, especially the resume ones, like turn me off so much because this is much easier than what you would have to do to get accepted, and honestly probably good for you to be achieving anyway, just so that you can be having those types of experiences and growing as a person and as hopefully a physician later on too. Now, I know we talk about this in a podcast that's upcoming, kind of about the MCAT requirements, but Kavya, how do you tell students to approach like the MCAT requirements? Is that something that they should be scared of? I feel like that's a big thing that they are nervous about.
I think it definitely does depend on what BSMD programs you're getting into. If you're debating between a BSMD program that has an MCAT versus doesn't have an MCAT, I would like recommend not using that alone as your deciding factor. Personally, I had to take the MCAT for my BSMD program, and although it was stressful to like study for that exam and take it, in the long run, I think it was fine for me to take, and like I see the benefit honestly of me having taken that exam versus I know other students or in other BSMD programs that don't require the MCAT, they kind of, yeah, they have the ease of not having that stressor, but they definitely have less of a sense of how they feel about like where they're at with like the sciences and that kind of material before going into med school.
I think that's a good point. It shouldn't be the only thing that they're basing the decision on. It should be like a culmination of all the things we're kind of talking about. Not one factor really should be like the yes, that is why I'm going. It should be, yeah, look at everything. Now, what about for like BSMD students? If you are kind of debating between traditional and BSMD, what should they think about for like the med school side of things?
Yeah, I think this is a very good thing to focus on, and this ended up being like one of my main deciding factors in considering the BSMD programs. So not only is getting into med school like a stressful and just a big ordeal to deal with, but like getting into residency is also a pretty big ordeal. So something to consider is definitely the match rate of the medical school, which basically is like a percentage of the fourth year medical students who apply for residency and get in during the whole match process. Do keep in mind that there's some inflation of this percentage online usually because they account for people who got in like the second round in terms of match for that year. But I do think it's important to see the range of specialties that students are getting into, the locations where students are getting into, and like the number of people per specialty students are matching into, because I think that can show you like what the school like excels at in terms of like, are they having students go to a bunch of different specialties, or is there a focus on like primary care and internal medicine for particular schools?
I think
So I
that's
think
true
that's
for
one
like,
factor.
and I think that's true for like pre-med schools as well. Like a lot of parents will ask like, or students in general will ask about like, what's the pre-med acceptance rate for traditional schools of those students? And I have often found that those numbers are like super inflated as well. It's hard to get a straight answer because a lot of the times there'll be like a tiny little asterisk where it's like, well, it's like a student who had like a 5.15 or higher, or 3.8 or higher, or, over the last 5 years. So it is like hard to know exactly what the pre-med acceptance rate is from a traditional school into a med school. And some do have like really good track records, but others it is hard to like know exactly what you're getting into, and how they're kind of quantifying that as well.
Yeah, I definitely think like online, especially, and I don't know the extent to which this is like actually true, but I do know that some students like think or they say that like they have a higher chance of getting into the medical school if they're undergrad compared to like a traditional applicant that's applying from a different undergrad school.
Mm.
I don't know how true that is. And I know another thing is that obviously when applying to medical school, there is that benefit of an in-state application versus an out-of-state. But again, that's like more in terms of like thinking about residency from the med school perspective.
Definitely. Yeah, I don't think that you necessarily have better outcomes. Like there are some like pathway programs, I feel like from like an early assurance programs, of course, like those are going to be a different story. But yeah, I don't think like, so for example, Indiana University, they've got, or Indiana University College of Medicine, out of their like 800 in-state applicants, like 300 are getting accepted, and they've got 6,000 out-of-state applicants and only 65 are getting accepted. So, I mean, there is going to be like a huge boost. And so some schools have like a much like even steeper proportional rate of in-state versus out-of-state acceptance rates. So that is an important thing to consider too, about like where you're from, where you're going to school. But yeah, I think if you went to like Indiana University, you probably wouldn't have a significant boost of getting accepted versus a student who went to Purdue, as long as like you had equal stats.
Mhm.
And those types of things, I don't think that that would give you like the competitive edge per se.
I also think like in addition to like thinking about like residency and match rates, it's important to consider like what the med school actually offers to you, not just like the concept of the BSMD program.
Mhm.
Um, so like personally, I really liked my med school's curriculum and like outlook on medical education. And that was like pretty much my main deciding factor. I really liked, I don't know, like their goals in terms of their medical education. And I go to a medical school where it's not necessarily the traditional curriculum, but it's the curriculum that a lot of medical schools are trying to move towards, which is a lot more like patient-centered, patient-focused, and trying to integrate a lot of clinical learning experiences more early on compared to just in the latter half of medical school. And I also think it's important, it can be more difficult with some BSMDs, but I think it's important to go to the med school and see what it's like and see what the students are like and what the culture of the med school is, because there are some med schools where people are just really stressed and not happy, and it can be a bit toxic, versus there are other med schools where students can actually be happy and like excited about school and excited about the experiences they're having. So I do think that is something for you to look into if you know that your like surrounding environment at school can impact you a lot. I do think that's something to prioritize looking into.
It's a great point. I don't think that many people will go visit the med school. They think more about the undergrad. But the med school obviously is going to be where you're spending the latter half of your academic years. And so I think that is a really good point for people to think about. And honestly, at this point, we've got a few weeks until the May 1st like decision deadline. And so if they haven't visited like their top, if they've got two traditional schools and one BSMD program that they're kind of deciding between, it might be worthwhile to go visit all of them if they haven't had the chance, even the undergrads too. Everything, just so that in the med schools, just so kids get kind of that opportunity to decide. It's hard
Yeah.
to understand and what Nicole was saying before too. It's just hard to understand the scope of some things, the size of schools, both big, and we didn't necessarily talk about this, but some of these BSMD programs are so itty bitty. Like some kids' high schools might be bigger, like Caldwell and St. Peter's. They both have, I think, less than 2,000 students. I've seen some BSDO programs that have like 600 students. And so that's not for everyone. And visiting can really help you see exactly what kind of environment you're getting into.
And ultimately, that's why you're applying to BSMD or BSDO is for the med school. So, absolutely go check it out if possible.
Now, Nicole, some kids think about major selection. So what should students be thinking about when they think about like the majors that they have applied to under the school, like both traditional and BSMD?
Yeah. So a lot of them could possibly be similar, but some BSMD programs you have to pick a specific major. Some BSMD programs give you a little bit more of flexibility, like Drexel gives you 3 options, I believe. So really taking a fine-tooth comb and diving into what that actually entails. What courses are you actually going to be having to take if you are a biology major versus a chemistry major? Some kids who really have a passion for neuroscience or they want to do more of a public health, work and kind of take some of those classes, actually taking a look at what is required and, by those majors specifically, I think would make a big difference.
Mhm. And I think that's something kids don't think about either. It's like, they kind of kick the can down the road where if they're forced to do like a biology major, but biology is like the bane of their existence, um,
Yeah.
they might not thrive in a biology major and maybe need to rethink if those programs are going to be right for them, if that's going to be like the main focus. So that is a big thing that I think kids don't necessarily think about if they're forced or not forced to do a major.
Yeah, and then, looking to your traditional schools and what you actually applied under. I think there's also some kind of misconception sometimes about, oh, I'll just change my major, and that's not always as easy as it sounds. So if you applied under a biology major, or if you applied under, a major that you might not be the most thrilled about, but I'll just switch, it might not always be possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually have a conversation with a family tonight about this. Got into University of Michigan under a kinesiology major, but he's pre-med. And so now he's starting to doubt, like, is this going to be feasible to get everything done within the 4 years? How can I juggle like my kinesiology major with making sure I'm able to do everything that I do need to do? So, those types of things are going to be important factors just to make sure that on the both traditional side and BSMD side of things that you're able to handle things without too much added stress to you. And I guess it's important to know, I don't think this was said, but some BSMD programs do have so much flexibility in their major choices that you can do. Um, I think it's Brown, most likely it's Brown, who says you can like literally pick any one of their majors that they have. GW, George Washington University, is the same, pretty much the same way, where you can pick any major in the College of Arts and Sciences. So I've had kids do a wide variety of different majors and still get accepted to BSMD programs, things from like journalism to public health, math, computer science, really anything. And so within reason for a lot of these programs. And so that can be something that if you do have kind of those outside interests, you do maybe want to do like a non-traditional, like, pre-med major, a BSMD program might be a good way about doing that too, potentially. Now, this I think is a big one and something that comes up a lot in both new client calls when we're making college lists, as well as, right now in April when we're trying to help students make choices about where to go. And that's going to be the name brand of the undergrad and medical school. Kavya, what kind of advice would you give to students as they kind of weigh the name brand of the schools?
Yeah, I think this is a big thing that impacts a lot of people's decisions, and there's pros and cons to it, obviously. I do think that there's this like notion of if I go to like a top ranked school, the traditional route, I'll have really good odds of getting into a med school later on. And because of like just having that school on my resume. And I think like, yes, that can be true, but that doesn't take away from you needing to have those GPA requirements and those MCAT requirements and all the different clinical and volunteer experiences. And I also do think like people tend to forget that at these top ranked schools per se, you have a lot of equally competitive students who are also interested in applying to medical school. So it's kind of like you're dealing with a much more competitive pool of people in your like local environment around you. So that can be additionally stressful if you are going the pre-med route. And also on the other hand, like once you're in medical school, you will realize that a lot of the students are composed of very different undergrad experiences. There are a lot of kids who go to like a medical school that like they can all like a good amount of students are from Ivies or top ranked schools, but there also are a bunch of, undergrads that aren't necessarily as top ranked that are represented as well. And I do think advice that I got from a bunch of physicians when I was making this decision was when like you're a doctor or clinician working, patients don't really ask you what undergrad you went to. They don't really care. They just know you have a medical degree and trust you from that point of view. So I do think you have to think about this in terms of what it means to you in terms of its importance, like the name of your undergrad.
So true. Like if there was a gun to my head and I was told that I had to say where my doctor graduated college from or went to medical school, I would have literally no clue. And it never was something. I feel like it matters more about like how they treat me and like how well they do their job. It doesn't matter if they went to like UPenn's medical school or the lowest ranked medical school that's super small, as long as they do a good a good job. So the medical school is definitely probably the thing I care about least. And it's funny too. I was talking to one of our new parents, and he was talking about how he graduated from an Ivy League medical school and did like a fellowship at WashU, and then now he's doing like family medicine. And he was like, I really didn't need to do all of those things for where I'm at. And so I'm sure no one really asked him where he graduated from or those types of things, but it doesn't necessarily impact what might happen in the future too.
And I do think that medical school in general is just so competitive now that like just getting in is like the main thing kind of, and that's the hardest part for like applying and getting into medical school. So I feel like once you're in med school, it's kind of like, okay, you got in, now you just have to get through it versus like with undergrad, it's like you have to stay competitive throughout if you're going
Mhm.
traditional route.
And that's a great point.
Yes.
I'll go for it, Nicole.
No, I think that's just a great point that, you're focusing on, we're in and we're, kind of not coasting, but it's just one less thing to worry about versus I need to stay as competitive as I've been, if not more.
Mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of traditional students are really taking a gap year. And we've noticed that quite a bit with students. And I think that that's kind of a factor overall that students should be considering and thinking about. So, Kavya, kind of comparing yourself to people in your medical school, do you notice that a lot of them did do gap years or have had like different experiences overall of the traditional students?
Definitely. There is a lot of students in my vet school who have taken at least 1 to 2 gap years. I think for my school specifically, it's like 60 to 70% have taken at least 1 or 2 gap years. So I think that is something to consider, not only as just a factor of the traditional pre-med route, like needing to take gap years to like boost your resume just because med school applications are so competitive nowadays, but also the environment and your peers, like who are you going to medical school with? What life experiences do they have? Versus if you're going through a BSMD program route, like your life experiences can be very different or much more narrow compared to your peers in medical school. So I definitely do think that is something to take into consideration. I do think a lot of people tend to underestimate the importance of having life experiences and exposure before going to medical school, but it really is important because it does impact like your knowledge in terms of being able to provide care and information to patients or just understanding your patients. So I do think that's something to think about at least.
Yeah, being a good doctor is much more than just being the smartest person in the room. It's how you can convey and connect to people is such a huge part. And having those life experiences can make a big difference. Yeah, whenever I'm talking to students and, they don't really necessarily see the merits of like an 8-year program that maybe still makes you have to do the MCAT and still has some of those requirements with resume and of course GPA. And they're like, they don't think it helps them save any time. But I'll have to remember this stat about, 50% of students are really doing like 1 to 2 gap years because it could, even the 8-year traditional, or sorry, the 8-year non-accelerated BSMD programs could be saving you 1 to 2 or potentially even more years of experience or of time just because you already have that guaranteed spot in there.
Yeah, and just to go off that point, my particular program is an 8-year BSMD. And like in when talking to my advisor, like in when I was already in the program, we kind of talked about the importance of having life experience. And she kind of harped on the idea that the reason the program is 8 years and not like 7 or 6 is because they want their students to have the time to have life experiences and like to see different like aspects and perspectives in life before going to med school because it's already, if you think about it, accelerated because you don't have those gap years in between undergrad and med school.
Definitely. And there are some BSMD programs that, do allow for gap years if you do feel like you're missing out on those life experiences. Like, for example, Brown University, you can do up to like 2 years of gap year. And so like they're like an 8-year kind of traditional BSMD program. And they let students do those 2 gap years. And in those gap years, you can getting like your master's, you could be doing like a intensive like research project or getting working as a job, as for a nonprofit or for Teach for America or kind of whatever you want to be doing. And so that's, I think, a good time for students to be getting those like important life experiences and seeing other corners of the world that maybe they wouldn't have had a chance to do. And then I have a couple students who are at UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago's BSMD program. And for both of them, they graduated early and were able to do some gap years. One even did like 2 gap years, and is now applying. Well, he has his secured spot at UIC, but also applying out to other medical schools because he's just been like, building up his resume during those gap years. And so it could be an opportunity to kind of strengthen resumes and really solidify that BSMD in medical school is right for you.
Yeah, that example just reminded me of another important point to think about, whether or not your BSMD program lets you apply to other medical schools or not. Because there are a lot of programs that don't allow you to do that. And if you do decide to apply to programs, they take away your secured spot if you do that route. So that is also something to consider if you're going into the BSMD program thinking, but I might still want to apply to other medical schools down the road.
It's a great point. Yeah, UIC definitely lets you apply out. And then, like, for example, Nova Southeastern's BSDO program allows you to apply out to other medical schools as long as you have like your diploma, and things along those lines. So that is a huge thing to kind of think about and helps you keep your options open. Takes the stress off of this student too. So for example, for like the one student I was talking about, he only applied to medical schools that were, higher ranked, that maybe did fit his needs a little bit better, and definitely applied to a whole lot less a whole lot less medical schools than probably a regular traditional applicant it did, because he already had that acceptance in his pocket. So it's kind of the nice thing about it. You can shoot your shot, and if it fails, you still have your spot to go back to as long as they allow you to apply out. Now, what about the kind of maybe one of our last few points about like time in BSMD versus pre-med? So, Nicole, what would you say a lot of BSMD students can be focusing on while they're in their undergraduate years?
Yeah, so I mean, they're not going to have as much time, but they do have the time to focus on other hobbies, some extracurriculars. They have a little bit of downtime. They're not, constantly chasing and even more experiences, more shadowing, so they do have the time to kind of explore a little bit more and have a little more of that traditional undergraduate experience. Even though they're in a BSMD, they're taking the courses, but they have a little bit more time like a traditional student versus, a lot of our pre-med students are going in from day one needing to find as much resume boosting activities as possible.
Yeah, something whenever like students are writing essays kind of about like why this BSMD program, why these, like how it will essentially like help you fit your goals, is because you might have just like more time to pursue something that's not very medicine focused, and then grow as a doctor. Maybe it will change what type of field you're interested in. So I think that can be the
Mhm.
advantage of those BSMD programs. Now, what do you think like a traditional like pre-med student should be worried about, Kavya?
Well, being pre-med is stressful for a reason. You need to dedicate a lot of your time to just like getting research experiences, volunteering, shadowing doctors, getting leadership positions on top of maintaining, good grades and doing well in the MCAT. So I do think a lot more of your time and your commitments as a traditional pre-med student are focused towards making your application for med school. So I do think that is something for people to consider, because also a lot of med schools like when you have hobbies in undergrad. So it's a lot of time management and a lot to balance as a traditional pre-med versus having that guaranteed acceptance as a BSMD student.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people do not think about enough. They might coast in their freshman year because they're getting used to college, they're getting used to their classes. So they don't really start volunteering. They've done a million things in high school, so maybe they're kind of tired. They're not necessarily joining clubs or things like that, and maybe waste some time. And I've had kids who are so focused on like maintaining that like 4.0 that then they don't have time to do anything else. But then they probably will be forced to take a gap year, because resume building and having those experiences usually are such an important part of this process. So there definitely is a lot of stress. Everything that they were doing in high school, you really just have to kind of escalate and take to the next level in both like depth and breadth of activities. Now, Nicole, I don't know if you can quantify this, but how many of students got into BSMD and didn't go, if you can remember, and like what were some of their reasons why?
Yeah, there's definitely been a few, probably more than I can recall at the moment, but it ultimately comes down to kind of a lot of the factors that we talked about. I use Rutgers as an example. A lot of students who are from New Jersey want to apply to the Rutgers program. They may not be thrilled about being in Newark versus the New Brunswick campus. And I've had students who got in and have chosen to have gotten into other out of state BSMD programs and said, you know what, I'm just going to go to Rutgers, New Brunswick, and stay in state, and the tuition is going to be much less. That's definitely one that stands out to me. It's always a conversation that I bring up when I'm talking to my families from from the state of New Jersey, because when you're looking at the bottom line, you know, months earlier, we'll worry about it when the time comes, but when you're really looking at that bottom line in, March, April to make that May decision, it's really hard to kind of turn away from.
Mm-hmm.
I've also had students who've gotten in DO who have chosen bigger name schools in their area, or even actually not so much in their state, but just bigger name schools versus a smaller DO. That's just somewhere that they would see fit. And I think it also boils down to the student truthfully recognizing. I mean, we spend months writing essays and convincing admissions teams that we are committed to medicine and this is our calling and we know for a fact it's what you want. But so much can change, and having an exposure, maybe they're ultimately deciding, I love the idea of medicine, but I want a little bit more flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll ultimately have chosen a traditional route.
Yeah, I think mine are kind of similar in their reasons why they turned down things. Some that pop into my head, like I had one girl who got into Stony Brook's BSMD and she got into a few BSDO in the New York area as well, which was where she was from. But then she also got into UPenn, and she agonized over this for a really long time. And ultimately, it totally was the draw of UPenn. I feel like she felt like she could not turn down like an Ivy League. And so that's ultimately where she got ended up going. Another one that kind of pops into my mind is I had one student who got into BSMD, but then got into Duke as well and was an engineering major there. And he actually got a full ride to Duke too through like the National Merit Scholarship. He was kind of like a very specific major that he had to, or award that he had to apply for and interview for. And it was really intensive, but, ultimately got a full ride, like room and board and everything for Duke. And so, of course, it's hard to turn that down. And so he ended up going there and is actually not a pre-med student anymore. I think he just graduated from college, but not, ended up changing his mind and not doing BSMD. I think he's doing something more in the business world. And I think that a lot of times does happen. And I think we didn't necessarily talk about that either, is I think one thing that students really need to think about as they make this choice is how much or how certain are you that medicine is like the right career for you, and like ultimately has to be very much like them driven and like come from within, because it's a long path, as I'm sure Kavya can really attest to, and it's not going to be easy and no one else can do it for you, and so they really do have to want it. So I think that is maybe one of the big reasons why we see kids turning it down, is they have maybe some doubts, but then it could be for other reasons as well.
Yeah, and just to say, like, there's nothing wrong with not being sure and then deciding to go the traditional route, because I know people that have done that and have gotten into the same exact school that they were got into the BSMD program for, and it
Mhm.
works out fine. But I know there are a lot of people who turn down the BSMDs and go to like an Ivy or a top school and then ultimately choose not to pursue medicine because like it's a lot to deal with being a pre-med student.
Mhm.
So I personally was weighing between, like top schools and BSMD programs. And I think what it really came down to was like, what did I want to do as a career and like what my end goal was. So I think for me, a big thing was just like, well, I want to become a doctor. I want to go to medical school. I got into medical school. So like, let me make my life easier and
Mhm.
let me like enjoy my time as an undergrad, because I know the traditional route would be a lot more stressful.
And this could vary from person to person. Like, just because you went through most of the application process thinking this is going to be right for you, your opinion and your choice can definitely change when it comes down to like the May 1st decision day. Like no matter what you said in the beginning, it could change. I've definitely had kids who are like BSMD or bust type kids. And then when it comes down to the decision, they end up switching because they get an offer that was too good to be true, or maybe decide that, you know, they do have a little bit of doubts. It doesn't matter what. So it's better to really think about it now when it is a little bit easier to decommit or to change your mind ultimately. Anything else you guys can think about what to think about for BSMD versus pre-med?
Not really. I think, like you're kind of alluding to, just follow your gut when the time comes. And I think that'll just be the best way to make the decision. If you're having any doubts for medicine, maybe the BSMD route's not your option. If you have something else great sitting in front of you.
I would also say, like, I know a lot of students don't like make this decision alone, like their parents can be involved and things like that. So I do think you need to pick a school that would be kind of what Nicole was saying earlier, but like the best fit for the student to like prosper and grow and do well in. Because I feel like kind of just picking a school because it sounds good versus picking a school because you know like that your child or you yourself can excel there are very different things.
Completely agree. Completely agree. Ultimately, what's the best fit for one student is not going to always be the best fit for another. And so think about it. Think about like what your learning style is best and you know what you want out of your college experience, because these things do matter. Like where you live for the next 6 to 8 years of your life is going to have a big impact on your happiness overall. So think carefully before you make your choice. It's not easy, but it is an important big decision. And so if you're lucky enough to have multiple acceptances, really think critically about what's going to be the right fit for you. All right, I think that's all we have to say today about, you know, multiple acceptances and choosing between BSMD and pre-med. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe to get more great content from the White Coat Club about BSMD and med school admissions. But until next time, we'll see you soon.